Sticking with the subject of colour correction, let's start to look at some of the surrounding tools that we might be using as part of a colour grading session. Let's first of all look at how we might use LUTs, lookup tables. A lookup table is a preset transform between different methods of describing colour. Example uses might be to transform how a particular camera stores its image data into a colour space that's more universal, or to view our output as it would appear on a particular film stock or through a particular projector or monitor. There are a couple of different ways of applying LUTs, so let's have a look. The simplest is inside the colour corrector. On the Setup tab, we can access a drop-down list of available LUTs, and they're in fact stored in a folder that's referenced in the manual. It's under the etc. folder of Mistika. There's 1D LUTs and 3D LUTs, so I have just the one in at the moment. It uses the popular ITX format, so any LUT that's in this directory will appear in this drop-down list. So simply, if I selected a LUT, enabled it, and just as a safety in mode I need to turn on use 3D LUT, and then 3D LUT is applied, I could continue to grade with this colour corrector, with the transformations of the LUT being applied as part of the colour transforms of my grading. Or, if there are no other colour transforms applied, then this RGB corrector is doing nothing other than a LUT transform. Using a LUT in an RGB colour corrector is simple, but because of its simplicity, a little restricting. For example, this LUT selection is system-wide, meaning that any other colour corrector on the timeline only has a choice of using this LUT or no LUT at all. So if you're using the colour corrector to provide the services of a LUT, then the LUT must be consistent across the whole timeline. So we'll look at another feature in a second that allows us to be a little bit more flexible about how we choose and apply LUTs. But before we do, we'll just look at one more feature in the colour corrector, and it's this match LUT. So I'm just going to disable the LUT and press match LUT. After about a second or so, what's happened is Mistika has re-enabled the LUT, but constructed a colour grade that roughly approximates the reverse of the lookup table. So in other words, if I switch the LUT off, we can see what it's done to the incoming image. Essentially what it's tried to do is compensate for the effect of the LUT. So an example of where we might use this is, let's say we were provided with all our source material from a particular film scan. So we're expected to deliver all our material in that colour space. Perhaps it's a logarithmic colour space, because those receiving the material from us are expecting to apply a particular lookup table. However, we're also given a shot from HD video that is in the middle of our edit. Now, needless to say, if we sent that to the recipient and they put a 3D lookup table upon it, it would look very odd. So the purpose of this function is to approximate as closely as possible what we'd have to do to that incoming HD video, so that when it was sent to the recipient and they put the 3D LUT upon it, those processes would be neutralized and it would look correct in the edit. It is an approximation. It's quite close, but it's not perfect. If I put it back on, we can see that if I double click here, this is the original shot. Then this is the shot that's been graded and had the LUT applied to ungrade it, if that makes sense. So we can see there's some differences, particularly in the highlight areas. But as a reversed engineered LUT, for the purposes that it's designed for, it's usually quite adequate. Let's look at a more flexible way of applying LUTs. We also have a dedicated LUT effect here. And this LUT gives us a lot of flexibility about how we apply our lookup tables and in what order. Essentially, processing happens from the top folder through to the bottom. So if all we wanted was a 3D LUT, we could just simply select 3D LUT. It'll give us the same drop-down list as before, and there's our LUT applied. But before it and after it, we could also add a 1D LUT. An example of where we might use this is where our 3D LUT is expecting a linear input, but our source material is perhaps of a logarithmic colour space, or some other nonlinear colour space, in which case we could apply the lookup table in here that would go from that space to linear space prior to the 3D lookup table. So now the 3D lookup table will behave as expected. And then optionally we could add the reverse table beyond it to perhaps place our output back into the original colour space, but after the 3D LUT has been applied. In addition to that, we can also add in some simple preparation to the inputs before the LUTs get applied, and simple export after the LUTs are applied. For example, we might just need to make a simple gamma change to the input before the combination of LUTs get applied. And likewise on output, we could make any adjustments, or we could tell it to use the reverse of the input. Again, to neutralize what we did on the input in order to prepare our footage to be correct for the LUTs, but actually to restore the gamma curves that we were looking for. Looking at how we work in the timeline, let's just go back to this being a graded master. So here we have our master which has some grades on it. We can use the timeline to decide how and where the LUTs are applied. Let's say, for example, our footage was coming from a particular camera or film scan, and we wanted to run it through a LUT before we graded it, and so we're happy to burn in that LUT. In which case, we would place the LUTs between the image and the colour corrector. So let's pick this shot. We could apply our 3D LUT, and now we're grading having had that 3D LUT applied. This would mean, of course, that as we output our grades, our LUT would have been burnt in, it would have been applied to the input image before the colour grading happened. If that's not what we required, then instead we can grade in the original colour space of the incoming image. We can then apply a LUT to the output of our grades. Remember that clips in the timeline don't have to be the same length as the ones underneath. So a LUT that's the same for every shot may as well be a single entity rather than cut into all the different clips. So again, let's apply our LUT into here. So now we can see from the monitor below that if we view this level here, we're looking at the original footage through a colour grade. Let's just add a colour grade just so we can be clear about that. So here's our original footage, and here's our graded footage. And then as we go up here, it now has the lookup table applied. So we can now make a decision about whether our LUT is burnt in or not. Remember that within the visual editor, depending on where we double click is what we look at, and where we single click is what we control. So in this configuration, our colour grade is acting on the original footage in its original colour space. But we can view that colour correction through the LUT. By double clicking on the LUT and single clicking on the colour correction, we can make our colour corrections whilst viewing the effect of the LUT. This gives us the opportunity when we come to export. If I were to render this level, then I'd be rendering an output with the LUT included. On the other hand, if I rendered this level, I'd be rendering my color corrections, but without the LUT applied. This is how I could run a grading session whilst looking at the result of a LUT, but knowing that actually what I want to deliver are my grades without that LUT applied. Simply hiding the LUT as well on the timeline allows us to see it with or without. This method is also true for other functions. For example, let's say that we were going to crop this image to a certain dimension. And let's just randomly put something in just so we can see a change. Again, because the crop is at the top of the process stack, I have my original footage here, which is being color graded and then having a lookup table applied and then being cropped, which means that if I've double clicked on the crop, I'm grading looking at my master framing, and I can make my framing adjustments as I need. But I'm still keeping my options open because the crop at any point could be hidden, thus revealing that I'm always working on the full image, even if I'm choosing to view through a crop, which means that if I were to output this level, I'd be outputting a master through the crop, knowing that I've always got the full frame material should I need it. Alternatively, I might just be using this as a convenient viewer, but it was always desired that I would provide my footage without the crop. There are other functions we might also come across in terms of color space conversion. Under Effects, we have Cineon Correct and Export and Log Correct and Export. They're both designed for converting an image to or from logarithmic space. The Cineon Correct adheres to the correct codec specifications, whereas the log effect is a pure mathematical linear to log conversion. And again, it can be before or after color correction, so you might put it immediately onto the incoming footage to correct it, or you might use it purely as a viewing device. Also, there's an RGB to XYZ color space conversion. So this would convert between the two color spaces, and the default numbers in here are the correct conversions to prepare the master for DCP, a digital cinema package. There's also a legalize function that has no parameters. It simply clamps illegal signals that might be left over from color grading in high dynamic range. So by combining the variety of effects that Mistika has to convert between color spaces, along with the way that images flow within the time space, we're provided with the ability to handle pretty much any combination of pre or post converting images, either to burn in those transforms or to use them simply as viewing tools.